Ladies and gentlemen, Jake Colvin.
That's what we really needed was Mr. Borstein to calm everyone down. So thank you very much, Bob. My name's Jake Colvin. I'm with the National Foreign Trade Council, and we're a business association based here in Washington, D.C. and New York. Our business association represents mainly U.S.-based multinational companies like Google, like Microsoft, but also like Caterpillar, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, and Walmart. And we promote an open, rules-based trading system. And so I just wanted to welcome you here to talk about the free flow of information as an economic issue. So the free flow of information for us is not just a human rights issue, but it is also an economic issue. The information revolution has fundamentally changed business, the way that business is done around the world. And so what you have right now across the world is that the ability to access and transmit data reliably and securely across borders is critical to the success of individuals, companies, and to economic growth for entire economies. If you want your GDP to grow faster, you need to be connected to the internet, and you need to allow for the free flow of information. That's obvious for companies like Google and Microsoft, but it's also critical for our other members companies, manufacturers, service providers, big companies, but small companies as well. And it's also critical for individuals, for entrepreneurs, researchers, hospitals, universities, you name it. McKinsey put out a study last year that talks about how 75% of the value of the internet in terms of productivity gains goes to companies that would exist without the internet, so non-ICT companies. Is my time up already? I'll give you one example about how it matters to a big company. GE is one of our member companies, and they build power plants. But they build intelligent power plants, and so they embed software in the systems that allow the power plant to communicate with a remote monitoring system. Now, you can't do that without the confidence that good regulations and policies are in place, both in the country where you're building the power plant and where you're remotely monitoring it from, that will guarantee secure and reliable access to information. And so all this isn't just important to big businesses, it's important to small businesses and entrepreneurs as well. The internet allows small businesses and entrepreneurs, mom and pop shops, to reach new markets, to test ideas and interact with partners from around the rest of the world. And so eBay is another one of our member companies. They estimate that in 2010, 20% of their gross sales, about $4 billion, were conducted by micro enterprises that were exporting. Bloggers are also making a living this way. I mean, this is important around the world. If you're a small business, you need reliable and secure access to information in order to access these platforms. And all of that means that the way in which each of our countries treats information and data, it matters to us. It matters to our economies. It matters to business. And interrupting legitimate flows of information becomes then a barrier to trade and economic growth. So what we're here to discuss is that businesses, individuals, and governments all have an economic stake in having a framework that permits access to and transmission of legitimate flows of information. One problem that we see, and we're a business organization that focuses on public policies and the rules governing the global economy. And those rules, the current framework, was written without the internet in mind. So I'm going to talk in a little bit, and Josh Meltzer from Brookings is also going to talk about how the international trading system developed. Well, the last time the international trade rules were modernized was about 20 years ago. And so it was written before the internet advances really have sort of come into force. But with the right tweaks, that international trading system could be used to guarantee the flow of information around the world. So what we'd like to do is have a discussion about that today. Brainstorm about how to create a better international framework that will secure access to information around the world. So there's going to be two parts to this breakout session. The first is you're going to hear a couple of brief presentations with some PowerPoint. Carl Kalapesi from the Boston Consulting Group is going to talk about the impact of the internet on economies in general. So he's got some research that he's going to share from BCG that openness to the internet impacts local, national, and global economies. I'm going to come back for a couple of minutes and talk briefly about the importance of the global trading system generally and how that relates to the ability to transfer information around the world. And then Josh from the Brookings Institution is going to provide a case study. Right now, the U.S. is holding negotiations with several of our trading partners towards a new trade agreement called the TransPacific Partnership. And this is one of the first times that we're really discussing in detail the free flow of information as a trade issue. And so Josh is going to talk about this. Is kind of an exciting time for trade wonks that are writing new trade rules, and Josh is going to talk about that. And then after Josh, Anupam Chander is going to discuss legal constraints and other challenges to doing business across borders. Anupam is a professor of law at the University of California, Davis, and he's going to talk about issues like data center location, intermediary liability, privacy regimes, other regulations which matter to the way that we conduct business internationally, and which right now enjoy broad exceptions in the current trade rules, and so can be used as a barrier to the free flow of information. So once all that is over, in about a half an hour or so, we're going to assemble into breakout groups. We want to hear from all of you. The goal of the breakout groups is to dig a little deeper on some of the issues that we covered here in the presentations. And so briefly, I'll describe the breakout groups. Keep in mind as we're going through this how you want to divide up, and once we're done with the presentations, we'll assign tables to the leaders of the breakout groups. So first, the first breakout group is going to be led by Josh Meltzer from Brookings, and it's going to talk about the overall impact of the Internet on economic growth and dig a little deeper into new trade rules that might be required to ensure access to information. Second, Anupam is going to talk about the kind of data that's needed to bolster the argument that international flows of information are important to the success of individuals and businesses. So we're going to talk a little bit about, he's going to talk a little bit about what studies researchers should pursue with all of you. And then Carl is going to manage a discussion about how exactly the Internet is affecting small businesses and services in all of your countries. So for each breakout group, if you could designate someone to report back to the group after they're over, we're going to do that. We're going to talk for about, I think, about 20 minutes in the breakout groups. And then we're going to come back, and then we're going to have a group conversation about what we've learned and try to come up with some takeaways. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carl, who's going to do the first presentation. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a quick video. So BCG, back in 2010, started doing some work in the UK on the impact of the Internet on the economy as a whole in the UK, and we've now rolled that out across the G20 and a whole bunch of other countries. So these are just some of the high-level facts, and then we'll dive into some of this a little bit numbers, and then talk about what this might mean in terms of the information flows that were just being discussed. So the first thing I want to do is just give you a bit of a flavour of the range of what we're talking about in terms of the size of the Internet economy. It ranges from around, and I have no clue why none of those numbers are appearing on the slide, and I apologize for that. It ranges from something like 2% up to something like 8% of GDP. The average across the G20 is about 4%. So there's a huge difference across these countries in terms of how much the Internet is impacting on different countries. And I'm happy in bilateral discussions to go into how we came up with that number, what are the drivers for that. The second thing, is there a reason why none of these numbers are showing? Okay. Doesn't matter. Okay. Well, look. Basically, what we're trying to show here is that there's a lot of differences in terms of where countries are currently in terms of the use of the Internet and how they're changing in terms of the growth. And that you've got a lot of the bigger countries that are not actually growing as fast as a lot of the emerging countries, as you might expect. What we then wanted to try and show here is that we did an SME survey in about 14 different countries and looked at how smaller businesses that were using the Internet in different ways were growing relative to businesses that were not. And across a whole range of countries, the pattern is very, very consistent and very, very clear, which is that companies and small companies that are using the Internet are growing significantly faster. They're generating more sales, and interestingly, if you look at certain countries, they're actually generating significantly more exports than companies that are not using the Internet. And it's actually that ability to reach a global audience even as a very small business, that is one of the big drivers of growth for a lot of small businesses. The last piece of data I want to focus on is the value that the customer gets from the internet. So as we all know, there's a lot of free goods and services that are provided on the internet that in all of the other sessions we're talking about what that does in terms of empowerment, what that does in terms of the change in the political dynamics, what that does in terms of rights. But what we've tried to do is estimate what that does in terms of cold hard dollars and cents. And what we've found is that consumers are getting a lot of extra value from free goods and services that they're able to get online. Whether that's from, we looked at email, we looked at search, we looked at the content from news media, and a whole range of categories, and looked at to try to put the dollars and cents to that. So, before I finish, I wanted to just take that a step back and say that's the kind of macro view of how the internet is impacting on the economy. But what's driving that change? The big thing that's driving that change is actually the data flow, the information flow that is allowing that sort of economic activity to take place. So BCG has actually been working with the World Economic Forum and a lot of the companies actually who are present here and are not present here, some of the biggest companies in the world as well as some of the smaller startups, to look at what's happening in the personal data space and how is that potentially creating economic and social value, and what are some of the constraints to that value creation, including privacy and security. And where we've come to is we released a report last week that looks at the issues of trust, privacy, security in the use of personal data. And what we concluded is basically personal data, as everybody I think already knows, is an asset. And it's an asset that needs to flow to create value. But, as was already touched on, it's an asset that doesn't have clear trading rules. It doesn't have clear rules on what you can and can't do, on who has the rights to do what with it under what circumstances. So basically where we got to is, it is an asset which can create value. There is real risk that that value will not be realized because of the concerns around privacy, security, and trust. That the data, one of the things that we talked about quite a lot about in the report was that data is a tradable asset and it needs to flow to create value. In many ways, data in a server that's not being used is the same as money under a mattress. It's not being leveraged, it's not creating the amount of value it can. But one of the things that we also discussed is personal data is different to other tradable assets. And when we talk about the trading rules, this will matter in terms of how we define those trading rules. It's an asset that is personal, that is linked to an individual. And that means that suddenly, as opposed to when we're trading oil or when trading another physical good, we have to take into account that there are now 7 billion stakeholders in the trade of this asset who all have a right to be involved in how those trading rules are set. And how do we define trading rules when there are 7 billion stakeholders? We don't have a conference room table big enough to fit them all. And the second thing we also talked about is that the other big difference to other tradable assets is that data is not used. It's not consumed when it's used. In fact, using data creates more data, which creates more potential value. It actually increases with value. It increases in value with use. And how do we set trading rules for an asset that has those characteristics? So we concluded that we do need a set of trading rules. We need principles that balance the interests of all stakeholders because data is an asset that different stakeholders have rights to. And lastly, we concluded that those rules need to be flexible based on context, but we need to have some sort of enforceability to them. And in the report, we go into detail in looking at how we might set those rules for the security aspects of data versus the usage aspects of data. And the nature of the conversation needs to be different, and the nature of the trading rules needs to be different for securing the data versus using the data. And I'll finish there. So lastly, just in terms of things, if you want to look at the data, then the first link there, bcgperspectives.com, Winning in the Digital Economy, has all of the reports for the country reports, the G20 and so on. And the personal data report you can find on the World Economic Forum's website. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Carl. Let's see if I can get my presentation up. thank you, Carl. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the overview of the international trading system and how that links to information flows. So Walter Isaacson said recently that, told me recently that Steve Jobs was seized with the importance of improving the framework governing the flow of information around the world in conversations that he had with him for his book. And so he's not the only one. Increasingly, our companies are seized with this sense that if we don't modernize the global economic framework, it'll become harder for all of us to access and utilize the information that we all take for granted. Before we talk about how to modernize, I wanted to talk about what the current system looks like today, though. I would sort of preface this with a disclaimer that I think trade is generally beneficial. I think probably all the folks you'll hear from today do. It helps businesses reach 95% or more of the customers that live outside of their borders. It helps diversify your customer base, so if things aren't going so well in your own country, you have increasing demand elsewhere to sell to. And we already talked about how the Internet benefits small businesses using cloud-based technologies, online platforms. And it's also why we get to eat raspberries in winter, peaches in April, and have affordable clothing and $199 Kindle Fires. So economies today, I think, if you look at the current framework, economies generally maintain open markets for goods and some services. And what we have today is a pretty open, pretty transparent international system that deals with trade issues as they arise and disputes between trading partners. But that wasn't always the case. You step all the way back to the 1920s and early 30s, there was a wave of protectionism. And so in the United States, we passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff back in 1930, which was seen as worsening the Depression at the time, and other countries followed suit. Since then, countries have largely been on a trajectory to improve flows of information in open market, flows of goods in open markets. So Roosevelt, back in the 1930s, authorized the Secretary of State to engage in bilateral market opening agreements. Then, in the post-World War II era, countries got together and proposed an international trade organization, which took a while to get put into shape, but it resulted in 1947 in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And so what you had after World War II were several rounds of incremental trade liberalization. So every decade or so, countries would get together and lower tariffs, liberalize trade rules generally. They began to address other issues like rules governing intellectual property rights protection, government procurement, and other things. The last major round, though, as I mentioned before, was in the 1990s. It was called the Uruguay Round. And extended commitments in the trading area to some services and created the generalized agreement on tariffs in trade and services. It also established the World Trade Organization, finally in 1995, which had been proposed all the way back when, in the late 1940s. So since the mid-1990s, the trend has been, for the United States, but also around the world, to engage in smaller free trade agreements, bilateral free trade agreements or regional trade agreements. NAFTA was the first really big example of this. More recently, we had the Central America Free Trade Agreement, an agreement between the United States and Korea, and right now we're engaged in trying to negotiate a Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we're not the only ones who are doing it. Other countries around the world, Chile, New Zealand, China, have been very active in pursuing free trade agreements with their major trading partners. But so what all this, in the past 50 years or so, this system isn't perfect, but it's pretty good. And it's the best example I think we have of shared governance. The rules are generally respected. There's an enforcement mechanism. You get together in the international system, and a panel of adjudicators will decide on complaints and permit countries to retaliate against other countries that do them wrong in the trading system. And the basic rules are generally pretty solid. To be really brief about it, they're transparency and non-discrimination. So what the trading rules say is that you can have tariffs, but they must be published, transparent, apply generally to all countries equally, and they generally have lowered over time. Regulations must also be transparent and should not discriminate against foreign suppliers. There's this fundamental issue of fairness in the international trading system. It's also become increasingly important to economic growth, and it's largely risen thanks to advances in technology, container shipping back in the 1950s, and then the Internet, the combination of which has allowed companies and individuals to improve logistics and send things around the world, disaggregate their supply chains, and do things in different places that they used to do all in one place. The problem, though, is that this was built for shipping goods, not services or information. The trading system was built for shipping goods, not services or information. So since the last update was 20 years ago, the current rules don't adequately guarantee the free flow of information. So why is that important? It's because outdated global rules lead to uncertainty and what we're calling sort of a new kind of digital protectionism. So there are a small but growing number of government public policies around the world that are creating new virtual walls which could undermine the free flow of information. So to give you just a couple of examples, several countries have proposed or enacted rules that would require financial services companies to process data onshore within their country. Others have blocked access to U.S. information-based services like Facebook and WordPress. China's done a whole lot of things, but one of the things they've done is propose conditioning market access on where intellectual property is registered. So if you want to sell to the government, you've got to, they say, or they would have proposed that you innovate locally. There are also barriers to technology products, hardware, which enable access to the internet, or tariffs, basically, still on some technology products. And then, as Anupam is going to talk about, even where policies are designed to support legitimate objectives, national security, law enforcement, privacy, businesses can be at a disadvantage when those rules are unclear or if they're arbitrary, non-transparent, or unevenly applied. And then one of the other things to look at is that increasingly companies, because of the complexity of how they do business, countries may assert multiple jurisdiction claims over the same piece of information. So if you're doing business on the cloud and you're an American company accessing servers in Canada, but you've taken your laptop to Australia, you could face three or four different claims to jurisdiction for the same piece of information. That's really complicated, and companies can get wrong-footed on all of that. So there's a need to create this bulwark against digital protectionism. Some of these figures I mentioned already, but just to sort of reemphasize the point that maintaining openness to information and ideas is critical for economic growth. McKinsey says that 2.6 jobs are created for everyone destroyed by the internet, and the OECD says that the overall impact on productivity of the internet is greater than any technology enabler in history. And I think we still tend to think of small businesses as kind of these mom-and-pop operations that need protection. I think that's certainly how governments think about them when they talk about constructing trade rules. The reality, as we see them, is that they're driving innovation and development around the world. And they're also creating new business platforms. I already mentioned eBay, but there's Kiva.org, this microlending site that leverages international information and financial flows to help small entrepreneurs on the ground in developing countries. So what we've tried to do is, with our businesses, we've proposed creating a modern framework to guarantee international flows of information. We released a set of business community priorities that we developed with a number of our member companies and the Chamber of Commerce and others in the business community, where we highlight the importance of cross-border commercial and financial flows, the importance of modernizing international rules and practices for information, and forums where we could make progress to develop these new trade rules. And I think Josh is going to talk a little bit more about that. So what we're looking for is building a modern global trade framework. We think that we need more explicit commitments in our future trade agreements to permit the flow of information. And I think the other thing that's important, which will be talked about later, is that you really do need consistency and interoperability of regulatory systems because companies are more exposed to different sets of rules and regulations. Certainly privacy is a good example. You need to get better alignment because this is confusing for companies when they try to go operate across borders. There are some understandings in place. The U.S. and EU have something called the U.S.-EU Safe Harbor, which is a mechanism for U.S. businesses, particularly small businesses, to understand and comply with the EU privacy directive that's currently in place. And that helps an American company that may not be familiar with the international system or have a team of lawyers that can figure it out. Helps them get right with a different country's set of policies. I think we need to see more of that in the international sphere. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, who's going to talk a little bit more about specific negotiations that are going on right now. So thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit in more detail about the World Trade Organization, but I won't spend too much time there, and I'll briefly go into a bit more detail about what Jake referred to as one of the free trade agreement negotiations, which is currently really the only thing that the United States is focused on at the moment, which is the TransPacific Partnership negotiation. I think giving you this overview will then set it up for those of you who want to participate in the breakout session, which I'm going to be running, which will then go into in more detail the types of principles and rules that we could think about, and the TPP more or less as being a vehicle or one of the vehicles where you could possibly start thinking about getting these rules into some form of international agreement. So some of this we've gone over already, but just I don't assume there's any deep tradies here, so it's worth repeating and going into a little bit more detail. But this is just some of the background of the multilateral framework, which is really what all countries have signed on to. You can see at the bottom there are currently 155 members, but essentially there's been a series of trade rounds since 1947, which have built the trading system as we currently know it, and ultimately which ended in the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which was a product there you can see of the Uruguay round, which round went for 8 years and was considered at that time a very long trade round. But we'll talk briefly about the Doha round, which is well and truly longer than that, but certainly that's the institution that is now responsible for governing and managing international trade. So the WTO agreements comprise of the GATT, which is essentially what everyone understood as the key instrument governing world trade up until the WTO, and that covers trade in goods, but you can see there's also other important agreements within that. There's one called the General Agreement on Trade in Services, which in many respects is like the GATT but covers trade in services, and that's certainly something we'll talk a little bit more about in a breakout session, because that's more relevant when we start thinking about the role of internet and the free flow of information and data. There's another agreement here which has been particularly important, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, which governs the way all WTO members protect a variety of intellectual property rights. And there's a dispute settlement mechanism, which is really one of the key elements of the World Trade Organization, which is really a binding dispute settlement system where countries can adjudicate complaints that one country is not complying with their WTO commitments, and ultimately a breach of the WTO is a breach in international law, but also it can lead to the complaining country imposing effectively trade sanctions on the other country if they don't then essentially comply with their WTO commitments. So it's a very effective dispute settlement mechanism and is very well regarded. This is just an overview of the WTO and basically how it's set up. It's more or less just a schematic of the WTO agreements. I won't go into that in too much detail. You can see that in addition, though, to these sort of key agreements I was talking about, there's a bunch of other agreements. Some of them really we don't need to focus on at all when we think about the internet, but some of them, for instance, the technical barriers to trade agreement could have some relevance, but this is a bit more into the weeds, so I won't go into that today, at least in too much more detail. So this is just an overview of the WTO, what its mission is, how it works. And so essentially it's useful to think about it probably at least in two parts. One is that it's a negotiating forum, so it's where countries come to try to essentially negotiate new commitments which will liberalise trade. It's also got the dispute settlement part of it, which we've already talked about. And it's also got a formal secretariat. It's in Geneva. There's 600-odd people there, and they sort of manage the agreements, and there's a lot of work that goes on around that. The actual aim of the WTO, I've just quoted the preamble there because it's not, we need to think about international trade as not really an end in itself, but as a means to these type of goals: increased standards of living, full employment, while protecting the environment, taking developing country needs to account. So there's a whole basket of issues which try to get balanced and managed in this system. And the key principles around really what the trading system operates is this idea of essentially non-discrimination. And I will go into that in a little bit more detail later on, but essentially the idea that you should not really be discriminating between goods and services between different WTO members. So for those of you who have not heard of the Doha Trade Round, consider yourself probably fortunate, but it's been going since 2001 when it was launched in Doha, and the first paragraph there provides an overview of the range, the basket of issues that countries committed to negotiate, to reduce trade restrictions on, and in some areas to develop new rules on it. And that is how the round started. There was essentially a ministerial meeting, which is when all the ministers, usually trade ministers from all the WTO members, get together and try to get a deal done. And they met in Cancun in 2003, and the result was that a lot of these new issues, which you can see there were trade, investment and competition, were dropped from the round. And the focus was then on this idea of market access, which is essentially getting rid of a lot of the barriers to trade in these topics. So this, as I said, it's been over 10 years now since the Doha Round has been going, and I think we can safely say today that there's no way forward for the Doha Round. I think this has been clear for probably at least a year and a half, if not 2 years, but at the ministerial meeting in December last year, it was abundantly clear that the package doing an agreement on all the outstanding issues was not going to come together. And there's really no sense at the moment of how we are going to move forward with the Doha Round. It's still alive in the sense that it hasn't formally been put to bed or killed. What's going on at the moment is that countries who are still wanting to see some progress on issues in the Doha Round, which they consider to be particularly important, are now trying to get together smaller groups of countries in what is technically termed a plurilateral agreement, and to see if they can make movement there. So the United States, for instance, is certainly taking the lead in areas of services liberalisation. Trade facilitation is another area which is being discussed. There's a couple of others, but that's sort of what is the state of play at the moment, where there's sort of a picking apart of different parts of the round and seeing if progress can be made on them individually. So the TransPacific Partnership negotiations, this is the current list of countries who are negotiating it. This is a free trade agreement, more commonly referred to, it's a regional free trade agreement because it's more than 2 countries, and it's the United States and eight other countries, so it's 9 countries in total. I've just got a map up here showing you the geographic spread of the countries. Of the dark green are the TPP countries which are currently negotiating the agreement. And while there are only 9, there's a lot of interest in other countries joining the agreement. So Canada, Mexico and Japan have all formally, sort of in different ways, expressed interest in joining the agreement. These other 4 countries are also interested in joining, maybe not immediately. I think the thing about the first 3 countries is that they actually want their preference, I think, to some extent, is to join now while the original agreement is being negotiated, while the other countries are probably thinking about joining onto the agreement once it's been finalised. And the key point here really is that there's a sense that this could be an agreement which becomes an Asia-Pacific free trade agreement, so it could build out into a very substantial trade agreement. This is just some brief history of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'll go through it very briefly, but essentially it started out with these 4 countries negotiating a free trade agreement which was called the P4. The United States agreed to basically negotiate an FTA with the P4 in 2008, and other countries joined, and by 2010 Malaysia was the last country to join, and we had the current makeup of TPP countries. So the reason that, there's various reasons why the TPP is being negotiated. I'm just picking a couple of probably the main ones here, but certainly the difficulty in moving forward multilaterally with the WTO Doha Round is one of the key ones. free trade agreements generally, and certainly it's true for the TPP, can really tackle issues which you're not going to be able to tackle in the WTO even if you had a successful outcome. So there's two elements to that. One is that you can go further in some areas than you really would be able to in the WTO. So even though, say, for instance, services is part of the WTO Doha Round, you might actually be able to do more on services with a smaller group of countries than you would in a large multilateral setting. And you can also address issues which are not covered in the Doha Round. And some of the key topics, I think, which are now being considered in the TPP, which are certainly not part of the Doha Round, are, for instance, how do you regulate state-owned enterprises and their impact on international trade? There's a couple more here: investment, regulatory coherence, and this idea of the free flow of data and over the internet. So this is where we're at with the TPP. There's been 12 rounds since it's started to negotiate it. Their sense is that there's a push to finish it this year. I don't think anyone believes that's going to happen, particularly if Japan, Mexico or Canada or any one of those countries is actually formally allowed to join. There's going to be a period where the administration will consult with Congress, and so that will certainly push out any possible completion into 2013. We're obviously in election year, which slows down the process as people focus on other issues. And in fact, even all that aside, I think that if you look at the way trade negotiations generally run, the tough issues are generally left to the very end. And so while you can make progress quickly on some of the easier stuff, it's when you get to these issues that things slow down, and we're only really getting to that point now. So there's a lot of work, I think, still to be done. But if it's not this year, I think there's going to be a real focus on trying to finish this agreement next year. Just quickly, and this is sort of a segue, and this will lead into what I'll talk about in the breakout session, is that the way of thinking about the significance of the TPP is not only from its current membership, but also the fact that it may be a template for what then becomes a free trade agreement for the Asia-Pacific region. So what rules are agreed in the TPP can actually become significant. Where it goes on internet, I think, is one of the things we're going to talk about. I just brought up here some of the rules on free flow of data that the United States and Korea have agreed to in their very recent free trade agreement that only actually came into effect in March this year. And there is, in particular, this Article 15.8, which I pulled up, which encourages parties not to impose unnecessary barriers to electronic information flows across borders, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. And then the question is, what else do we need? Thank you.
So, thank you. I want to begin by articulating a vision of an electronic Silk Road, an internet that helps people to become global traders and to learn from each other along the way. So this is part of a very large project, and I'm going to give you a tiny glimpse into this project. Be able to read the whole thing sometime pretty soon. Okay, so my mandate this afternoon is to describe some of the legal challenges that might hinder this electronic Silk Road. That is to impede the economic and other benefits that the internet can bring. In my few minutes, I will highlight two. First, I'll describe the threat of national laws that can undermine many internet businesses. I will focus in particular on laws related to intermediary liability and privacy. So whereas others have largely talked about international laws, I'm going to focus on national laws. Second, I will describe a threat to the coming revolution in cloud computing. Let me describe the issue of intermediary liability using two examples, both from the last few days. Last week, we saw an immense investment in an American social media company. I'm speaking, of course, of Pinterest, which received a $100 million private investment led by the Japanese company Rakuten. This valued Pinterest, a company barely 2 years old, at an astonishing $1.5 billion. The story includes both a lot of economic development, right, and also a significant foreign direct investment. As many of you know, Pinterest allows users to pin images they find across the web to their Pinterest pages. It doesn't help you upload your own stuff. That's not the point. But rather to act as a curator of stuff you like across the web. Now, while many of the pinned images are licensed or public domain, or their use constitutes fair use, it's likely that a significant amount of the material on Pinterest constitutes copyright infringement. Now, how can one have a business that might abet, many copyright people would argue, rampant copyright infringement, right? Now, the fact is that a U.S. law passed by a kind of, in some sense, a far-sighted Congress, of all things, in 1998, shields Pinterest. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act, an act that most of us love to vilify, has a title that is actually quite crucial to Internet enterprise, and that's Title II, the much less vilified among Internet activists title. That title holds websites safe from copyright suits if they carefully take down material posted when they receive notices of alleged copyright infringement, I should say. Now, the threat of being liable for copyright infringement is one that offline publishers obsess over. So this is my second example. Consider this amusing exchange with my publisher just yesterday. I had written the following sentence in this book that I've authored, and the book is in the manuscript stage. The sentence simply says, if an event in cyberspace occurs both everywhere and nowhere, in the words of a former Grateful Dead lyricist, whose law governs? Right, simple sentence. It's a sentence that cyber law scholars would find not particularly that exciting. It's just a statement of, it's a question. The manuscript editor sent me a note. She asked me whether I would kindly excise the 3-word quote, worried that there might be sufficient for an infringement lawsuit. Against whom? Not me, against the publisher, right? She writes, the rules of fair use regarding song lyrics are especially strict. Even 3 words from the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead, many of you may not, the Americans will know who the Grateful Dead are, and many of the foreigners will not, but kind of very liberal band, one would think, that allowed you to have, quote, bootleg recordings of concerts, for example. But even 3 words from the Grateful Dead can be a problem. You recall I had said, in the words of a former Grateful Dead lyricist, that the 3 words here are everywhere and nowhere. Now, you may want to consider dropping these quotations now, she suggested, rather than going through the permissions grinder, as she put it. And so I don't see that as a kind of particularly craven act by a publisher. I think that that is a kind of an act by a publisher who is understanding the difficulties of navigating the copyright world and where quotations might be problematic. It turns out that these aren't actually lyrics. They're quotes from John Perry Barlow's, some people will recognize, Declaration of Independence for Cyberspace. So it's not actually lyrics to a song, though I'm sure you can put it to verse if you'd like. Okay, so let me turn then to another example. Now, other nations too have acted to limit liabilities for web intermediaries, but they have done so with remarkably less conviction than the United States. And I'll be very eager to hear my KS's colleagues, my Korean colleague here, his thought on this. In South Korea, for example, the Seoul High Court ruled against a file trading website on the ground that the website could have designed its system to permit downloads only of music files that the copyright owner had provided a license to. Okay? It could have designed the system from the ground up on an entirely different basis. Now, an ask first requirement would have proved, of course, a death knell for Pinterest, would have eliminated the incredible economic value that it's created in the last 2 years. Consider India. So these examples are generally taken again from the news here, just to keep this recent. I don't see any South Asians there may be a few South Asians in the audience who should recognize this image. Consider India this last week, where ISPs were ordered by a court to block Vimeo, Pirate Bay, Dailymotion, the entire sites suddenly dropped off the internet for Indian users. Why? Because the makers of a local movie called 3 had petitioned to have these sites blocked because these sites had allowed the movie to be uploaded, right? And so the sites have been blocked. I'm sure the block will be removed. This is the course of things. You should watch this video, by the way, this Kalapesi video. Google it. It's a phenomenal video from YouTube. Choose the version with the 55 million views of all the South Asians in the many of the South Asians on the internet across the world. Now return to the other social media company that gained an immense investment last week. So here, of course, I'm returning to Facebook. While Facebook was launching its IPO, lawyers were revising a lawsuit against it to allege statutory damages of, and I'm not joking here, $1.5 trillion. The claim is brought under U.S. privacy law, and I don't mean to suggest in any way that the suit is meritorious by referencing this outrageous sum, but I mean to demonstrate that the risks of facing a life-threatening lawsuit, of the law bringing down the innovation and making it impossible, are not merely hypothetical. So let me turn from these kind of national laws that might sometimes help or hinder the development of internet industry. Let me turn to the second aspect of this, the second threat. This is a threat to the growing area of internet commerce, cloud computing, which is seen as really the future of our computing actions. So even in the cloud, we are seeing the emergence of a kind of checkpoint Charlie in the cloud, so a kind of effort to prevent data from being stored or processed in foreign jurisdictions. British Columbia, for example, requires that public bodies, all public bodies within that state, have the consent of citizens before allowing information about those citizens, not anything particularly sensitive necessarily even, to be stored abroad. Here's an official example of what this means. Okay? If a public body wanted consent to store a student's email about her parents' divorce on a server located outside of Canada, the public body would have to obtain the consent of both the student and each of her parents. If the student's next email contained the personal information of the friends she made during spring break, the public body would have to get their consent as well, right? This is, you might think this is kind of historic, pre-internet times. This is February 2012, right? And so these are the kind of constraints that national and regional governments, provincial governments are setting to the free flow of data. So now, why does British Columbia fear their data being sent to the United States? The Canadians fear a big brother in Uncle Sam. They worry that the USA Patriot Act might grant the U.S. government the ability to gather information stored in the United States on computer servers here with little process protections for their citizens. Now, this is another reason that we in the United States should look twice at proposals like CISPA. I'm not taking a view on CISPA, but at least suggesting that we be very careful, that give the U.S. government access to personal information with which what many argue is insufficient protections for individuals. Now, requiring national clouds harms the efficiencies that cloud computing is all about. Requiring national clouds can also be protectionist. I love the term digital protectionism that was just offered, using trumped-up privacy or security concerns to bar foreign providers. After all, national clouds prevent outsourcing, right? I say trumped-up concerns because many foreign countries themselves have their own version of the USA Patriot Act. We're not alone in our kind of sometimes overzealous efforts to put security over other liberties. Cloud computing helps reduce redundancies in computing resources, allowing us to pool our resources, allocating them as needed. It also, if all things, implicates climate change. Servers use a lot of energy. Small servers all over the world use a lot of energy, and huge computer farms use a significant amount of energy, certainly. And they should be located where energy is green, for example, where hydroelectric power is available or where cooling is readily available. One would have hoped that Canadians especially might have cottoned on to this fact and encouraged a free flow of data across borders. I kind of picture in my mind a server farm sitting in the middle of a kind of Alberta, northern Alberta town, warming the town during its cold winters, right? There are merely a few. These are merely a few suggestions of constraints. We need to think hard about roadblocks to the electronic Silk Road, obstacles to the economic and other benefits that the free flow of information across humanity should bring. Thank you.
All right, everyone. I'm sorry to interrupt here, but I want to just call you all back to order, and for a couple of minutes, just spend some time calling on someone from each table to get up and just talk a little bit about deliverables and what we've all learned. So maybe I'll start with Josh, and then we'll go just 1, 2, 3.
We had a brief but certainly full discussion. I think it's clear starting out that this is going to be an important issue going forward and something that's going to require a lot of attention and focus from all of you, certainly in this room, and everyone who's interested in this issue. And I think one of the things that comes out in this discussion is the range of balancing and that needs to be achieved in order to achieve what's going to be an acceptable outcome for each country. Each country is going to come to its own set of views and values, but certainly around the free flow of data issue, which we've been talking about and thinking about it from a trade perspective, one of the issues which is always out there is this balance between getting the free flow of data right and also obviously intellectual property protection. This is something which plays out here in the United States. It's, in a sense, there's a balance reflected in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Each country is seeking to strike its own balance, but certainly that's something which sits in the background of any discussion about the free flow of data. We had a couple of specific issues which also came out of our work group. One of the things was certainly around financial services, and we had a brief discussion about the way financial services operate, for instance, in Chile, and the costs associated with them versus access to them, and it's essentially a question of, I think, equity there and how that gets managed. Another issue which also came out, which is related to the copyright issue and also related to the free flow of data issue, is, for instance, if you have particular applications and services which run in one country and you want to access them from another country, what are the restrictions? How do you actually get access to them, and is it a copyright issue, is it an IP issue, and is there a way that we can resolve that? There's also broader governance issues which came out, for instance, the role of the WTO in this space, the role of the ITU in this space, and what this might mean in terms of how we think through these issues and how these actually are going to play out in the future. I mean, one of the examples that we discussed was domain name governance and what this might mean in terms of access to information and competition between different sites. I think the other key part, obviously, is the privacy dimension, and that is a piece of the free flow of data issue, which also is probably one of balancing in a way, which is something that Carl talked about a bit in his presentation, and which is that component of data which is being moved around the world, which is actually personal. How do you provide adequate guarantees for privacy which don't then become essentially unnecessary restrictions on trade? How do you get that balance right? How do countries manage to find a way of getting to a place where they're comfortable with the privacy bit of it at the same time while maximising the economic value from free flow of data? Thanks.